This winter, more than ever, with COVID-19 still circulating, we need help to reduce all avoidable risks. You can help protect the NHS, social care and loved ones by getting the flu vaccine. You may be eligible for the free vaccine at your GP or local pharmacy if you are over 65, pregnant or have a long-term condition. Find out if you are eligible at nhs.uk/staywell. Children up to Year 7 can get the free nasal spray at school or through their GP if they are below school age. If you are not eligible for the free vaccine, you can pay for it at your local pharmacy. The flu vaccination does not give you flu. It reduces the risk of catching flu, as well as spreading it to others. If you had the vaccination in the past, that will not protect you as the flu strain changes every year, so you need to have a new one this year. It is also important to wash your hands often with warm water and soap. Use tissues when you cough or sneeze, and bin used tissues as quickly as possible. Thank you for helping to protect yourself and loved ones this winter.
COVID-19 is in our communities and the number of cases is on the rise. So it's essential that we each play our part in full by following all of the government guidance. Only by doing this can we keep our schools and businesses open. If you're young and healthy, you may feel the virus isn't a threat to you. But someone more vulnerable to coronavirus than you, perhaps someone closer to you than you realise, is depending on you to play your part in breaking the chain of transmission. So I'm asking everyone to do their bit. Stick to the rule of 6 for gatherings indoors or outdoors. Wash your hands thoroughly and regularly. Wear a face covering in enclosed spaces. Observe social distancing of 2 metres or 1 metre plus precautions where 2 metres really isn't possible. Follow all of the guidelines about car sharing. If you have symptoms, self-isolate and get a free test immediately. If we work together on this, we can control the spread of the virus. Thank you.
My name's Jonathan Gribbin. I'm the Director of Public Health for Nottinghamshire County, and I'd like to tell you about the COVID-19 Local Outbreak Control Plan for Nottinghamshire. It's all about containing the virus so that we can protect one another, safeguard our critical services, and enable our schools, our workplaces, our communities to flourish again. And the plan describes how we will do that in Nottinghamshire. It complements the national test and trace arrangements, and it builds on local arrangements with key partners like Public Health England, the district and borough councils, the city council and our local NHS. It identifies a range of settings such as schools, workplaces, universities, care homes and so on, which require specific plans to deal with any fresh outbreaks of the virus. It describes how we'll be monitoring on a daily basis to spot if there are any new outbreaks, and then coordinating action to investigate and deal with them, deploying
Okay, now I don't know how familiar, you're probably familiar with the virtual hearing arrangements. There is a guidance note which is in the examination library on the website. If you wish to speak at any time, please use the hands up facility, which is the hand symbol on the top of the screen. Now there is a screen share facility in Teams, but I ask that you don't use that, please. Please would you keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking. You can, of course, turn your cameras off if you wish. If there is any loss of connection, if you experience any loss of connection, please contact the programme officer, Ian Kemp, who will reconnect you. So far in the examination, I produced my matters, issues and questions and supplementary questions to which the council and the participants have produced hearing statements, and they are in the examination library. There is a hearing programme and an agenda which are also in the examination library. The participants listed in the programme for each session will have the opportunity to put their cases, and others will have the opportunity to respond. I may also have some questions. My role is to consider the soundness of the plan in accordance with the criteria in the National Planning Policy Framework, and also whether it is legally compliant. The purpose of the hearing sessions is to assist me in this. The starting point is that the Council has submitted a plan that it considers to be sound. If you are challenging the soundness of the plan, then you have to explain why you think it is unsound and what changes would make it sound. I have read and will take into account the original representations that were made, and there is no need for these to be repeated. Instead, my aim is that the discussion moves on from those submissions and deals with specific questions that I have, or areas where further clarification or explanation is required. Please keep your comments focused on the matter in hand and avoid commenting on unrelated matters. I ask that in speaking during the hearing, I ask that you are concise and specific. It is helpful to me if you wish to refer to or highlight any parts of your statement or other documents, and that would be helpful to me when reporting. If any questions that I ask do not indicate that I've made up my mind, these are just intended to test the evidence, to provide clarification and explanation. There is a list of modifications which the Council has prepared, and that is on the website. And that list of modifications will no doubt be added to as the examination progresses, and I ask that the Council keeps a record of any further modifications that may be discussed. And then the final schedule of main modifications will be subject to further consultation before I prepare my report. The examination will remain open until my report is submitted to the Council. No further representations or evidence will be accepted after the hearing sessions have finished unless I specifically request this. The entitlement to speak on a particular policy only exists where previous representations have been made on it and where changes are sought. So discussion on each policy is limited to those listed. It is not permissible to hear comments in support of particular policies or allocations, or about sites which are not proposed for allocation. Are there any questions before we proceed this afternoon? Okay, now Miss Janice Bradley of the Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust, I understand, is on the telephone. Are you there, Miss Bradley?
It's just intermittently here, sir, I'm afraid.
Right. You haven't got a good line there. What I was going to say was, you can go first if you like, because I'm conscious that you don't want to be hanging on to the telephone for a long time. Do you want to make your comments first of all?
It would be helpful. Thank you. If I can respond to the questions as you ask them where relevant first. Thank you. Yes.
Oh, so right. So I mean, what we're doing, we're going through. I intend to go through all of the vision, and then all the strategic objectives, and then the strategic policies in order. So if you want to respond to each one individually, that would mean that you would have to be on the phone for quite some time.
For the whole call. Okay. If I could get, as I have a relatively small number of obviously points to make on these questions, if I am able to cluster them at the start, that would be extremely helpful. Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Nottinghamshire Minerals Local Plan
Right.
Okay. Okay, Miss Bradley. Now, which matters do you want to comment on?
So the first, sort of going back to the original order of the submissions and questions, my first concern, my sort of first point raised was about your initial question about the phrase until, in paragraph 3.5, your question 7, original 7, about the phrase until material considerations indicate otherwise, and whether it detracted from the clear statement of policy in subparagraphs A and B.
Right. Sorry, this is my matters and issues.
Yes. So your original number 7 on policies, your question 7.
Okay. Okay, yes.
Thank you. Does that tell you?
Sorry, it's a very bad line. I can't hear you very well.
Okay. So we'll just come back a little bit into range.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up quite badly, actually.
Sir, if you can.
No, I'm sorry that I couldn't hear that at all. Did you want to? You could. I mean, if you want to phone back later on this afternoon, that would be okay. If you can get a better signal.
Hello. Hello.
I'm afraid you're inaudible. I have, of course, I've got all your written representations, so your written representations will be taken into account. I mean, if you wish to, if you can move to somewhere where you can get a better telephone signal and phone back, perhaps later on, that would be fine.
Okay.
Excuse me, I think that's a good suggestion. If you continue with the session, I will give Jenny a call and oh, Janice, sorry, I'll give Janice a call, and we'll see if we can line something up for an hour or so's time.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, that's
Thanks very
fine.
much.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks.
Thanks.
Right. Okay. So
Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust.
can we deal first with
now
the
exiting.
vision, please? Now, okay, I've got the Minerals Planning Authority, Mr. North. Do you have any comments that you wish to make on the vision?
Afternoon, sir. Yes, my name is Mark North. I represent the Mineral Products Association, not authority.
Sorry.
That's quite all right, sir. It's quite a common misunderstanding. No, in terms of my comments on the vision, I believe that the proposed amendments made proposed by the Mineral Planning Authority will cover the issue that I raised. However, I will be coming back to that point under your question 15, under your original questions on the safeguarding policy, SP7.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and is and Mr. Coles of Barton in Fabis Parish Council. Is Mr. Coles there? Oh.
It's not Mr. Coles today. It's Professor Haynes Young is representing.
Sorry, yes. Okay, sorry. Professor Haynes Young.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. We have two points we want to make. One is about geographical spread, and it concerns our additional question, which you very kindly included.
Yes. Now, the geographical spread, I don't know if that's probably more appropriate to include that under the strategic policies later on.
Yeah, 19. Which we think that it actually is overarching. It's not a specific policy. It's simply a framework within which the policies are viewed. But we will be guided by you, obviously. I mean,
if you wish to make the point specifically in relation to the overall vision, well, yes, please do.
Fine. Okay. Well, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to put an additional question. And for those who've not seen it, the additional question concerned the issue of geographical distribution and the way it influenced site selection. Our concern comes about because it seems to prioritise geographical spread over the other dimensions of sustainability, and therefore seems to us to undermine the soundness of the plan. While we recognise that location, geographical distribution, is an important factor, it's not the overriding factor in determining the sustainability of a plan such as this. Now, we've set out our concerns in the written responses, and I don't intend to go over them here. The key points, really, though, are that we don't believe that the plan is sound because any positively prepared plan, the geographical allocation of sites would need to be consistent with a range of sustainability criteria, not just to access to market and transport. So we don't believe that geographical allocation alone enables the plan to be a positive one. There also needs to be a statement about how the different criteria of sustainability are weighed against each other in different geographical options, and why market access and HGV transport, for example, are prioritised over other factors. We also think that the plan should provide the opportunity to take into account alternative geographical distributions. Now, we don't deny that geographical distribution is important, but what we would ask is that in a sound plan, alternative geographical distributions should be compared. And the council have given no criteria by which that comparison could be made. So they lack criteria in order to determine which geographical distribution is more sustainable than another. Indeed, they also lack evidence in terms of the suitability of the geographical plan that they've come up with at the moment. We had this confirmed by Mr. Osborne James back in 2018. In correspondence, he said there is no published data relating to the geographical spread for the particular allocation of sites. So our issue here is, how would you judge the sustainability of a particular geographical distribution? Now, we believe that the only way you can do that is to look at the 5 options that were considered at the issues and options stage. A was geographical spread. C, I think, was barging, which those two were the ones that were put forward as the key. We would argue that, in addition, sites have to be considered on their individual merits. Otherwise, you'll be able to make no distinction between one geographical distribution and another. So just to finish, I mean, what we're arguing is that although geographical distribution is important, there are no criteria by which one geographical distribution can be compared to another. Indeed, in our written evidence, we've suggested an alternative geographical spread that keeps provision in the south, but allocates other sites which are more sustainable according to other criteria. So in summary, we believe that the plan is unsound because it's not been positively prepared. It's not consistent with achieving sustainable development because of the overemphasis on geographical spread and market access. It's not justified because it doesn't provide the evidence in favour of this geographical distribution rather than alternative ones. And finally, as a result of that, it's not consistent with national policy of enabling sustainable development to be delivered. And so our proposal is that the Minerals Plan needs to be prepared on the basis of options A, C, and D, and not A and C alone. And if it were prepared on these other criteria, we believe alternative geographical distributions would be identified that are more sustainable. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Would the council respond to those points, please?
Afternoon, sir. Yes, I shall give our response. So the plan making process is about balancing a range of often competing interests, and the decision is made on the planning merits in line with the national policy, and it's therefore not necessarily based on a number of respondents. The council has looked at reasonable alternatives as documented in the issues and options document, and the SA process measures these. The issues and options document asks 3 questions in terms of how important it was to maintain a geographical spread of sites. Would it be more appropriate to prioritise specific areas above others? And would it be economical to transport mineral by river barge? And if so, should proposals with barging potential be prioritised? The overall feedback on the first question was that geographical spread of sites was suitable, but other factors should be considered. The overall feedback to the second question was that prioritising specific geographical areas would not be appropriate, and that each site should be addressed on its own merits. The third question in the feedback in terms of the river barging was that people thought that it provides a sustainable form of transport, but on the flip side, concerns were raised about the economic viability. The overarching strategy for the plan is to provide a geographical spread of sites across the county. This is not a new approach and has been done in the adopted Minerals Local Plan 2005 and was also contained in the withdrawn plan. The geographical spread is taken into account with various other reasons, such as minerals can only be worked where they're found, the different markets that the minerals serve, such as the Greater Nottingham area, the central Nottinghamshire area, including Newark and Mansfield, and the northern markets and the exports to South Yorkshire. The location is also influenced by the location of existing permitted quarries or lack of. The consideration of when the quarries are expected to come online also features, and the amount of available mineral in each proposal. As a result, the overarching strategy is to provide a geographical spread of sites. However, in reality, the selection of sites comes down to a number of site-specific considerations to help piece together a steady and adequate supply over the plan period. And this has been done through a number of assessment documents that have been applied to all the sites put forward by the industry. This detail is included in the site selection methodology SD21, and therefore we feel that the geographical spread approach is a sound strategy. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Roy Haynes Young, do you have another question?
I'm afraid Mr. Osborne-Jones missed our point there, really. We're not arguing against geographical spread per se. We are simply suggesting that the particular geographical spread proposed, which does include allocation of sites in the south, fine, there is no criteria by which that particular spread could be compared to any others that fulfill the same geographical criteria. Why this geographical distribution rather than some other? Now, we argue the only way to do that is to include consideration of sites on their own merits. So within, the allocation to the south, for example, one could find a combination of other sites that have less environmental and social impact than the distribution that we have. Now, we're in this position because the plan never included any criteria by which a particular geographical distribution could be evaluated against another one. And that's there because they didn't seem to have included these other criteria. Now, it seems to be you can look at the options of the distribution of sites, which includes geographical spread, and then within that, you can choose some options which are more sustainable than others. And we believe that's not been done. We suggest that there's been one attempt to create a geographical spread. There's no evidence to suggest that's more or less sustainable than any other that fulfills this overarching criteria of geographical spread. And the reason we think this is important is because it's a strategic guiding principle. Unless you do this, how can you evaluate other sustainability criteria, such as the preservation or restoration of ecological networks? It's quite revealing in the comment that Mr. Osborne-Jones made. He made no or very little reference, as far as I could hear, to other sustainability criteria. It's simply geographical spread, access to markets, and minimisation of transport, which are all important. We don't deny they're important, but we believe a balanced plan should give room for these other dimensions of sustainability to be considered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Ms. Haley, do you have a comment?
Yes, thank you, sir. I would like to point out that all the sites that were put forward were individually assessed on their own merits in terms of the sustainability appraisal against 14 sustainability appraisal objectives. The sites were in the three main geographic areas of South Notts, Newark and North Notts. So a number of sites were assessed in each of those areas individually to give some detailed information. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for those comments. Mr. Keane, did you wish to come in there?
So thank you very much. I just wondered if I might ask Mr. Osborne-Clarke to deal with Professor Haynes Watt's points, which he came back to a moment ago, that suggests that there's been an undue focus on access to market and transport over other aspects of sustainability. Thank you.
Yes. Ultimately, the planning system is not an exact science, and it's about balancing the needs of varying different issues to come up with the most suitable approach to site allocations. As I said earlier, there were a number of elements that were assessed in terms of the sites, and again that was wider in terms of the markets they can serve, the influence of the existing permitted quarries in the county, and the ability to supply a steady and adequate supply over the plan period. Thank you.
Professor Haynes Young, did you have a further comment?
Well, I'd simply ask Mr. Osborne, James, then where are the criteria by which those individual site characteristics were balanced against these other factors that you just mentioned about geographical spread and access to markets? Is there a balancing exercise there? How are the different criteria of sustainability weighed in that process? And we believe unless that is part of the plan, then the plan is unsound, and the plan should include those kind of criteria.
Miss Haley, do you want to come back on that?
Oh, yes, please, if you wouldn't mind, sir. I would like to say that it was not considered appropriate to give any one sustainability appraisal objective extra weighting over any other, because all the three aspects of sustainability, economic, social and environmental, are mutually independent. And the ideal, of course, which would be to gain sustainability in all three of those areas. But as Mr. Osborne James said, in terms of planning, it does have to be a balancing act.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can we move on, please, to strategic objectives? And SO1 is improving the sustainability of minerals development. There were some representations made by the minerals industry on this one. Miss Owen, do you want to make any comments on this one? I think you're on mute. Oh. And Miss Conway, do you want to make any comments on SO1?
Yeah, I can do. I think we can only support really that they're now looking to remove this priority for extensions above other locations. I think that's supported. I think the issue is going to be then how that leads on in terms of the strategic policy and then actually the allocation of sites in terms of that approach and how that's been took forward.
Okay. Are there any other comments on strategic objective SO1? Okay. Yeah, so there is a suggested amendment. That's reference PM2. Mr. Ratcliffe.
Yes, good afternoon. So I don't know whether you want us to go through the substance of your supplementary questions on this objective, or whether just a general statement is required at this stage.
Well, no, there's no need. Obviously, I've read your hearing statements and your responses to my questions, so there's no need to go through that. It's just really to, if you wish to stress any particular points to this.
Well, just then, in that case, to go, Ms. Conway said that if there is a proposal to modify the plan to exclude this wording from the strategic objective, we would support that. But as she also does raise questions about how the plan has been prepared. Basically, its whole strategy is based on preference for extensions over new sites, and you don't remove the problem just by taking the particular wording out of the strategic objective.
Okay. Now I've got there's someone with the initial J. I'm not sure who that is. Oh, Jenny.
Yes, that's right. So it's Jenny Owen here. I lost you for a while, but I'm back now.
Okay.
You were asking me about whether I had anything to say about the strategic objectives, especially SO1. Yeah. Yes, in relation to the preference for extensions over existing sites, I think we've heard quite a lot, and there's quite a lot in the submissions that you've had about this. And also you ask a specific question later on about whether it is consistent with the planning guidance, which I don't think it is, and that each site should be considered on its merits. I think this also goes back to the geographical distribution that we were talking about earlier, and how the preference for extensions will just reinforce the existing geographical distribution. And I'm talking in the widest frame here across the whole county rather than specific sites. And with that, we have a problem in that the council acknowledged that the distribution has changed over the last few years as the sites in the south of the county have completed and are now exhausted. This means that we have now a skewed distribution, and this policy where we've got the preference for extensions is only going to cause that to be exacerbated in the future, because the south of the county has got no sites really that can be extended. So in my view, that the preference for extensions is not appropriate in this county at this time. Not saying that it isn't, it's not always inappropriate, but just at the moment, at this time in the county, it's not appropriate, and not appropriate to be in this plan.
Okay, thank you. Mr. North.
Thank you, sir. The only other point I'd make on that and the reliance on extensions is if there's a requirement to increase productive capacity within the county, and by productive capacity, I mean that processing plants have a certain maximum output, and if there is an increase in demand and there is a pressure to increase productive capacity, then an over-reliance on extensions will potentially prejudice that and interfere with that situation.
Okay, Mr. Osborne-James.
Janice Bradley
is now joining.
Mr. Osborne-James, do you wish? Oh. There's a hand up. There's SO.
Sir, sorry, I didn't have my microphone on. It's actually Suzanne Osborne-James. I think, unfortunately, our initials probably display exactly the same on this system. Apologies. Yeah. Just to come back on the points raised with regard to the preference for extensions. Yes, that is an underlying theme in terms of the approach of the plan in terms of site selection set out in the methodology document. For the sustainability reasons that we've set out in our written responses to you in relation to your matters, issues and questions and supplementary question. However, we do recognise, as a couple of the industry representatives have picked up, that wasn't intended to set out a policy position that would preclude new greenfield sites coming forward where there is a need. And indeed, there is a policy criteria later in the plan that I think it's MP2 does allow for sites to come forward where there is MP1 where there is a particular need. The proposed modification to the objective has been picked up, but I think we did also put in our schedule of proposed modifications a companion change to the policy to make that point clear. And if it hasn't, I can't quite draw it up at the moment. If we haven't actually put that wording forward, that is something we are willing to do.
Right, so would this be a change to the supporting text to policy MP2?
I'm just looking at the PM numbers. PM 25. Yes, I think it's, sorry, I was referring to the change in supporting text to make that clear. Sorry, sir. It's, yeah, the change to paragraph 4.2 at PM 25.
I see, right.
Policy and there is a related amendment to policy SP1, which is PM9, which removes the wording give priority to and replaces that to read support the extension of existing sites, which is intended to address this issue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Ratcliffe.
Yes, so if I just might respond to a few of the comments just made. One of the disadvantages of an extensions only policy in this case, particularly when there is a limited amount of forecast demand, which obviously we will be discussing tomorrow, whether that's adequate. But what's happened is that there's been an element of, I would say, musical chairs, in the sense that not everybody has come out with a prize. So what it will lead to is a concentration of productive capacity and reserves in fewer and fewer operators, and that's a product of what they put forward in terms of their extensions. One company put forward a few very large extensions, and these were accepted, and the planning authority has totted them up and said, well, that meets the need, thank you very much, we don't need any others. And so some companies, existing companies, are going to miss out. Some companies that would like to come into the county to trade have been prevented from doing so. When what the county council have effectively done is to really concentrate all the reserves in just a few sites, which is one of the things that national policy advises it shouldn't do. And it's all been done very above board. There's been no intention to do that, but nevertheless, that will be the outcome. And it's an inequitable outcome, and it would have made more sense to have allocated a little bit less to the companies that won the competition, and allowed the other companies who are already trading in the county. Let's not say that this is a speculative proposal from their point of view. They're already trading, they want to continue business, and they're going to be prevented because they lost out in the competition. And if the reserves had been spread more equitably, that wouldn't have happened, and it wouldn't have been such a severe impact. But what it would lead to, as Mr. North was saying, is there will be a general reduction in capacity for sand and gravel in the county. Now, the reason I say that is because there is usually assumption amongst mineral planners that any one site is as good as any other, and if one closes, then all the others will soak up the sales that the closed one was responsible for, but that doesn't happen. With respect, I think we've got a very outdated view of the industry in mineral planning. It may well have been the case 50, 60 years ago that anyone could dig any hole in the ground, load the material up into the back of a lorry and sell it out the gate. That's very rare these days. All these sites that we're talking about are very sophisticated, integrated businesses with downstream activities relying on them. So what happens if a company cannot extend its site? It has no further access to mineral resources in that particular area, but it's still got a number of downstream usually concrete product sites that are dependent on that. So what will it do? It will import the material, and that will be the natural outcome of this policy. As more and more companies get squeezed out of the market, the imports to Nottinghamshire will rise, because it's naive to expect that a company who's deprived of its ability to continue trading will give all its market share to its competitors. That just doesn't happen. So we do need a more nuanced and a much more balanced approach to how mineral planning authorities deal with the commercial aspects of it. And I know they're supposed to be deaf to commercial concerns, but the outcome of their activities does have commercial impacts. So these things really do need to be recognised, and plans such as this just need to be more equitable. And an extensions-only policy really doesn't do that in this case, and there needed to be much more flexibility in the way things were allocated. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. And Jenny Owen, do you have any comments?
Yes, sir. Just hearing what officers were saying there about proposed amendments, which seem to be working away now from extensions, prioritising extensions. If that's the case, should it not be that SO1 should also be amended? Otherwise, we're going to have some inconsistency in the plan.
Well, I think that
So
there is
proposed
an amendment PM2.
Yeah.
Perhaps the council could explain. Would the council like to explain the amendment, please, to SO1? You're on mute at the moment.
Sorry, sir. There are a suite of amendments that are aimed at this that I believe cover both the strategic objective, the related supporting text, and the policy. If I can repeat the numbers for those, if you just bear with me, sir. Modifications are proposed to SO1, Policy SP1, and the supporting text under PM2, PM9 and PM25 in document exam 16.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now can I just move to Miss Bradley, please, who is on the telephone, and hopefully you've got a better connection now. Miss Bradley, I think you're on mute at the moment.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can, yes.
Excellent, thank you. I've been able to hear a little bit of the last discussion. Yes, I'm now stationary and with a little bit better reception. Apologies for causing problems.
Okay, well, we're going a little bit out of order here, but it's just to enable you to have your say, you know, without hanging on the telephone for excessive periods of time. So which matters do you wish to comment on?
Yes, so going back to, it was the issue about paragraph 3.5 of the strategic policies, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. Now, I appreciate that obviously if I haven't heard any discussion about this from others, it may be that you've already heard sufficient. But my particular point was that I do think that is significantly important, because we do often in cases find that unless everything is listed in what here would be paragraph A and B, unless everything is listed sort of down to the last detail, then it's always open to misinterpretation. So, for example, the use of the phrase areas or assets of particular importance, we find may not be sufficiently robust to protect all assets, such as Biodiversity Action Plan on Section 41 habitats, which obviously are of great importance, and we all recognise that, and they're essential for the building of nature recovery networks. Unless everything is listed, then there is sometimes ways that they can be misinterpreted as not being present. So I suppose the answer is in either keeping unless material considerations indicate otherwise, obviously, or potentially increase what is listed in A and B, the subparagraphs of that paragraph, particularly to ensure, obviously, robustness. I think this brings me on to the other point, which I know you have before you in my information, which is about outweighing the benefits. This is a really serious issue, and many of us, I'm sure, have raised this in other examinations as well. Is the definition of outweighing the benefits, because that is
I mean, this is very similar wording to what is in the National Planning Policy Framework. So I think or perhaps the council could come in there, but it's really just similar. It's kind of repeating some phrasing that's in the National Planning Policy Framework, but with the council.
It is so, and I very much appreciate that. I think the problem is what we find is that in the reality of application at either an allocation or an application level, it isn't sufficiently robust. For example, things like local wildlife sites and biodiversity action plan habitats can be missed out if that's actually relied upon, and that is our concern, because this plan is an opportunity to obviously do it better.
Okay, so you really what you're asking for that paragraph to be made more detailed.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that would be very helpful, and also a definition of outweighing the benefits too would be most helpful. I appreciate that isn't something that's off the peg. It may be something that requires further work, as as a group of stakeholders or people thinking maybe around this table.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Keane. Do you wish to comment?
So yes, I do. It's not so much to respond to the NWT point, because, as you say, that the intention of the paragraph is designed to reflect largely the framework wording. But looking at it, sir, I think it will need amending, because at the moment it refers to no policies relevant to the application or relevant policies are out of date, etc. Whereas the framework now in 11D, as we know, talks about policies which are most important for the determination of the application being out of date. So it's slightly adrift of the latest version of the February 19 framework. So it'll need a tweak. So I just thought I'd flag it up as we're talking about the paragraph.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I had a note of that as well. Yes, that it needed to be updated. Yes,
we'll pick that up in the changing version of the proposed mods.
Okay, Mr. North.
Thank you, sir. And I apologise if I'm missing the point, but I'd also point you to paragraph 171 of MPPF and the need to take into account the hierarchy of different environmental designations. So I apologise if I was missing the point, but the way I was listening, any adjustments has to recognise that, because there is clearly. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Bradley, do you have any further points that you wish to make?
I mean, again, as I would say, it is the difficulty of what happens about application if things aren't specific enough when it actually comes down to the nitty-gritty, of course, of weighing these things up. I think I just wanted to flag up then that as well, the comments I'm making here now are notwithstanding the fact that as the Wildlife Trust, we obviously have great concern anyway about applications coming forward for unallocated sites, so that we're even in this situation in the first place. Because of course we come back to this really fundamental point that if a site comes forward on that basis, it hasn't actually been subject to a proper comparative essay, along with all the other sites in a proper way through a plan process, on a proper comparative basis. If it comes through 4 or 5 years later as an application for something that hasn't been allocated, even if you're making that robust assessment at the time of application, following all the correct policies, it hasn't been tested fully against other sites in the round in a properly comparative way. And that is a fundamental concern of ours, as I'm sure you'll have seen from my other submissions.
Yes, yes. Okay,
I think it undermines the principle of SA effectively.
Okay, would the council like to respond to that point? Okay. Ms. Bradley, do you have any further? Sorry, Ms. Haley.
I think unfortunately it's down to the way that the planning system works. In terms of preparing a plan and then possibly getting it adopted, and then at a later date, planning applications come in from unallocated sites. But those planning applications will be subject to environmental impact assessment, which is more detailed than the sustainability appraisal that we're able to carry out in the early stages of the plan making process. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Ms. Bradley, do you have any further points to make at this stage?
No, I mean, I believe I've said what I said. So obviously the distinction between environmental impact assessment at an application stage versus also needing that comparison against all sites in a fair way at the plan making process. I think there's probably no more to add on that one.
Okay. Okay, right. Well, thank you. You can, of course, hang on if you wish to, but otherwise I understand that you will be perhaps joining us for tomorrow morning's session.
I'll take it down again. Still doing it.
Can I hang on for a short while,
yes.
sir, and listen in if that's okay? And then whilst I've got good reception, I will try and listen in, because I obviously do want to hear other people's comments and evidence, and then add in at the appropriate stage with the other related to your later questions, your supplementary questions, if that's possible.
Well, we were just going through the plan in order, really, and we'd got on to strategic objective SO1, which I think we've finished with that one. And so if we can move on to SO2, please, which is providing an adequate supply of minerals. Okay, would anyone like to make any comments on SO2? Okay. SO3, climate change. Does anyone wish to make any comments on SO3? No. SO4, safeguarding mineral resources and infrastructure. Mr. North.
Thank you, sir. Yes, to start, I know the county are proposing to add the word reserves into the title and the body of that, which I welcome. I do have an issue, which I did raise in my submission, about the term of economic importance when related to mineral resources. And again, I'll be raising this on SP7. MPPF paragraph 204 C is very clear that it is the known locations of specific mineral resources. There's no qualification. It is known resources, not whether they're economic or not. And the purpose of that, as I'm sure you're aware, sir, is to protect minerals for future generations. They may not be economic now, they may well become in the future. So, as I say, I think that wording needs to come out in terms of economic importance. And bearing in mind the county have already agreed to change the wording in the vision from mineral reserves in paragraph 4 to resources. There's a inconsistency issue there. As I say, I'll be making a similar point on your question 15 and CSV 7.
Okay, thank you. Would the council comment, please, on that, on Mr. North's point about the reference to mineral resources of economic importance? Why does that need to be just confined to those minerals?
Sir, as set out in our response to the written statement, looking at the wording of the MPPF, it talks about the known locations of specific mineral resources of local and national importance, which we haven't read to mean a blanket definition of all minerals. The British Geological Survey Society, good practice advice does talk about recognising it may not be appropriate to safeguard the whole mineral resource where this occurs extensively and is not of particular regional or national importance. It makes clear that the mineral resource mapping is the starting point for this process, but may need to be refined based on geological or economic restraints. And I think in one of our earlier responses, we did also make the point, sir, that the mapping that the Geological Survey produced is actually referred to as the economic resource. That had led to the use of the terminology economic. We could look at a different way of describing that, but we don't think it's appropriate that the safeguarding mapping and the policies and the plan should safeguard all deposits for the reasons set out.
Okay, thank you. Mr. North.
Thank you, sir. Just to come back on that, firstly, MPPF in the definition section defines mineral resources of local and national importance as minerals which are necessary to meet society's needs, including aggregates, brick, clay, etc., etc., etc. So it lists out all the minerals. Again, I would contend that the MPPF is very clear in terms for its known location. And thirdly, accepting, which I don't, the county's point on this, what's the definition of economically?
Okay. What's the council's response, please?
Sorry, sir. The information, the mapping provided is from the BGS's economic resource area. It's also worth noting that if you look on Plan 2, you'll see that brick clay, for example, covers a significant amount of the county. And this is also the case for Sherwood sandstone. Therefore, if we were to safeguard the entire resource of all minerals known in Nottinghamshire, it would become an unusable system because the districts would be contacting us regarding safeguarding comments on virtually every application that was put forward. For the brick clay particularly, we contacted the two operators in Nottinghamshire and asked them which of the areas they were likely to work in the foreseeable future. And based on the meetings we had with those two operators, they identified the areas that went on to form the safeguarded brick clay areas, and as a result, that safeguards known resources, but equally balances the need to enable other development to happen. And like I say, with the brick clay in particular, we would end up with a situation that would be unworkable logistically between the district and the county. So that's an important element as to why we haven't just safeguarded all resources. And like I say, this Sherwood sandstone would be a similar situation on Plan 2. It would just become unworkable. So we've tried to take a proactive approach that safeguards the sort of economic reserves based on what the industry are telling us, but not gone to the extent of doing every last area. If you look on the sand and gravel, then that does cover a much larger area, which I think reflects where the mineral is worked. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. North.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I'm not wanting to labour the point, but the comments we just heard are precisely why the MPPF requires safeguarding all known locations. Now, the fact that Nottinghamshire is geologically rich, good. It needs to be safeguarded, and as I say, the MPPF is unequivocal. And coming back to the brick clay issue, again, that's defined in the MPPF as a mineral of local and national importance. Industry today, I would suggest, is not in a position to say what is viable and economic in 50 years' time, which is the whole purpose of the safeguarding paragraph in MPPF.
Okay, and
so if I may come back on that, yes. It's important to note that a similar approach to ours has been recently adopted in the Leicestershire Minerals Local Plan, September 2019, and that safeguards only those minerals considered to be of current or future economic importance, which I think is an important point to make. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Conway.
I was just going to emphasise probably Mark's point really, is that it's long-term economic value. Who's making the assumption on what the economic value is longer term? And then in regards to the point about the district authorities, I think there is a steer as part of the policy. Can't find it now, but in terms of exceptions or exemptions, if you like, to what could be considered as or need to be consulted with the Mineral Planning Authority in terms of safeguarding. So I think you kind of cover yourself a bit there with doing that.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yes, so in terms of the bricklay, then it was the industry that defined the areas that they considered important going forwards. So it was straight from the industry rather than us making any decision ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Right, SO5, and that is minimising impacts on communities. Any comments on that one? SO6, protecting and enhancing natural assets. Professor Roy Haynes Young.
So this is just a matter of clarification. We have some comments on the issue of biodiversity gain, covered as part of question 13 and 21. Are you covering this now, or are you coming back to SP2?
Well, I will come back to those under the strategic policies.
That's fine. We'll wait until then.
Yeah. Okay. SO7, protecting and enhancing historic assets. Okay. I suggest that we take a short break now before moving on to strategic policies. So it's 3:05. Can we take a break until 20 past 3? Okay. Okay, thank you.
This winter, more than ever, with COVID-19 still circulating, we need help to reduce all avoidable risks. You can help protect the NHS, social care and loved ones by getting the flu vaccine. You may be eligible for the free vaccine at your GP or local pharmacy if you are over 65, pregnant or have a long-term condition. Find out if you are eligible at nhs.uk/stay well. Children up to Year 7 can get the free nasal spray at school or through their GP if they are below school age. If you are not eligible for the free vaccine, you can pay for it at your local pharmacy. The flu vaccination does not give you flu. It reduces the risk of catching flu as well as spreading it to others. If you had the vaccination in the past, that will not protect you as the flu strain changes every year, so you need to have a new one this year. It is also important to wash your hands often with warm water and soap. Use tissues when you cough or sneeze and bin used tissues as quickly as possible. Thank you for helping to protect yourself and loved ones this winter.
My name's Jonathan Gribbin. I'm the Director of Public Health for Nottinghamshire County, and I'd like to tell you about the COVID-19 Local Outbreak Control Plan for Nottinghamshire. It's all about containing the virus so that we can protect one another, safeguard our critical services, and enable our schools, our workplaces, our communities to flourish again. And the plan describes how we will do that in Nottinghamshire. It complements the national test and trace arrangements, and it builds on local arrangements with key partners like Public Health England, the district and borough councils, the city council and our local NHS. It identifies a range of settings such as schools, workplaces, universities, care homes and so on, which require specific plans to deal with any fresh outbreaks of the virus. It describes how we'll be monitoring on a daily basis to spot if there are any new outbreaks, and then coordinating action to investigate and deal with them, deploying extra testing capacity if we need to, or contact tracing as appropriate. The plan also deals with how we will continue to provide support for people who are made vulnerable because they need to self-isolate, and we'll be doing that through our community support hub. And we'll refine the plan as we go along to reflect the latest best practice and the information which government will be providing to the council. Finally, I want to acknowledge the lengths to which so many people and organisations have gone to already in recent months to stick with the guidance, to maintain social distancing of 2 metres wherever possible, to wash your hands thoroughly and frequently, to stay at home if you or someone in your household has symptoms, to get tested and to follow the advice that you receive when you get the result. By observing the guidance, you're protecting not only your own life and livelihood, that of your friends and also your loved ones, but also that of people you may never meet, but people who you're depending on and whom we must each depend as well. Your role in that is critical. Thank you for your help to contain the virus.
COVID-19 is in our communities and the number of cases is on the rise. So it's essential that we each play our part in full by following all of the government guidance. Only by doing this can we keep our schools and businesses open? If you're young and healthy, you may feel the virus isn't a threat to you. But someone more vulnerable to coronavirus than you, perhaps someone closer to you than you realise, is depending on you to play your part in breaking the chain of transmission. So I'm asking everyone to do their bit. Stick to the rule of 6 for gatherings indoors or outdoors. Wash your hands thoroughly and regularly. Wear a face covering in enclosed spaces. Observe social distancing of 2 metres or 1 metre plus precautions where 2 metres really isn't possible. Follow all of the guidelines about car sharing. If you have symptoms, self-isolate and get a free test immediately. If we work together on this, we can control the spread of the virus. Thank you.
This winter, more than ever, with COVID-19 still circulating, we need help to reduce all avoidable risks. You can help protect the NHS, social care and loved ones by getting the flu vaccine. You may be eligible for the free vaccine at your GP or local pharmacy if you are over 65, pregnant or have a long-term condition. Find out if you are eligible at nhs.uk/stay well. Children up to year 7 can get the free nasal spray at school or through their GP if they are below school age. If you are not eligible for the free vaccine, you can pay for it at your local pharmacy. The flu vaccination does not give you flu. It reduces the risk of catching flu, as well as spreading it to others. If you had the vaccination in the past, that will not protect you as the flu strain changes every year, so you need to have a new one this year. It is also important to wash your hands often with warm water and soap. Use tissues when you cough or sneeze, and bin used tissues as quickly as possible. Thank you for helping to protect yourself and loved ones this winter.
My name's Jonathan Gribbin. I'm the Director of Public Health for Nottinghamshire County, and I'd like to tell you about the COVID-19 Local Outbreak Control Plan for Nottinghamshire. It's all about containing the virus so that we can protect one another, safeguard our critical services, and enable our schools, our workplaces, our communities to flourish again. And the plan describes how we will do that in Nottinghamshire. It complements the national test and trace arrangements, and it builds on local arrangements with key partners like Public Health England, the district and borough councils, the city council and our local NHS. It identifies a range of settings such as schools, workplaces, universities, care homes and so on, which require specific plans to deal with any fresh outbreaks of the virus. It describes how we'll be monitoring on a daily basis to spot if there are any new outbreaks, and then coordinating action to investigate and deal with them, deploying extra testing capacity if we need to, or contact tracing as appropriate. The plan also deals with how we will continue to provide support for people who are made vulnerable because they need to self-isolate, and we'll be doing that through our community support hub. And we'll refine the plan as we go along to reflect the latest best practice and the information which government will be providing to the council. Finally, I want to acknowledge the lengths to which so many people and organisations have gone to already in recent months to stick with the guidance, to maintain social distancing of 2 metres wherever possible, to wash your hands thoroughly and frequently, to stay at home if you or someone in your household has symptoms, to get tested and to follow the advice that you receive when you get the result. By observing the guidance, you're protecting not only your own life and livelihood, that of your friends and also your loved ones, but also that of people you may never meet, but people who you're depending on and whom we must each depend as well. Your role in that is critical. Thank you for your help to contain the virus.
COVID-19 is in our communities and the number of cases is on the rise. So it's essential that we each play our part in full by following all of the government guidance. Only by doing this can we keep our schools and businesses open. If you're young and healthy, you may feel the virus isn't a threat to you. But someone more vulnerable to coronavirus than you, perhaps someone closer to you than you realise, is depending on you to play your part in breaking the chain of transmission. So I'm asking everyone to do their bit. Stick to the rule of 6 for gatherings indoors or outdoors. Wash your hands thoroughly and regularly. Wear a face covering in enclosed spaces. Observe social distancing of 2 metres or 1 metre plus precautions where 2 metres really isn't possible. Follow all of the guidelines about car sharing. If you have symptoms, self-isolate and get a free test immediately. If we work together on this, we can control the spread of the virus. Thank you.
This winter, more than ever, with COVID-19 still circulating, we need help to reduce all avoidable risks. You can help protect the NHS, social care and loved ones by getting the flu vaccine. You may be eligible for the free vaccine at your GP or local pharmacy if you are over 65, pregnant or have a long-term condition. Find out if you are eligible at nhs.uk/staywell. Children up to year 7 can get the free nasal spray at school or through their GP if they are below school age. If you are not eligible for the free vaccine, you can pay for it at your local pharmacy. The flu vaccination does not give you flu. It reduces the risk of catching flu as well as spreading it to others. If you had the vaccination in the past, that will not protect you as the flu strain changes every year, so you need to have a new one this year. It is also important to wash your hands often with warm water and soap. Use tissues when you cough or sneeze and bin used tissues as quickly as possible. Thank you for helping to protect yourself and loved ones this winter.
Past 3. Okay, so we're on to strategic policies now. Now, in the previous session, I think Mr. Keane mentioned the need for a change to paragraph 3.5 A, and that's to reflect the wording in the 2019 framework. So if the council could make a note of that, please.
Yes, sir, will do.
Okay, policy SP1, minerals provision. Does anyone have any comments on policy SP1? No, okay. Policy SP2, biodiversity-led restoration. Would anyone like to?
I would please, if possible.
So, Janice Bradley, you wish to speak?
If possible, please. So thank you. That would be helpful.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, go on.
No, please go ahead.
Okay. I mean, clearly, I mean, I commend, the Mineral Planning Authority for this policy, which is excellent and far-sighted, and obviously I have been involved in the development of that. So my points here are really about the incredibly fast-moving pace, I suppose, in terms of other policy, national policy and sort of government thrust and so on, even whilst this plan has been evolving, and in fact, even since the submission that these last submissions that I made. So I think there's two key points. One is that obviously the government hopefully now appears to be, or Mr. Johnson appears to be, adopting the view that the 30% target for areas protected for biodiversity or of enhanced biodiversity may be a possible government policy way forward, which may or may not be reflected in written policy in time. But that clearly the stronger and stronger emphasis on the biodiversity and climate emergency that we find ourselves in, I think adds extra weight to this policy. So my concern is that I think there's probably some updating that needs to be there, even beyond what I'd said in my written submission. But we have to be very careful as well that the emphasis on biodiversity net gain, which is essential, doesn't mean that we then become tied to the minimum biodiversity net gain level that may or may not be set in the Environment Bill, which, as you know, is still progressing. That's setting a minimum of 10%, which obviously is designed much more for conventional development, housing, industrial estates, that kind of thing, rather than MPA matters. And given that mineral restoration sites have the highest potential to deliver large areas of habitats, well, we wouldn't want to have a sort of an unintended negative consequence in any way of being tied to that target. So I just felt that the emphasis on maximise here, that was already in the council's wording, could be further emphasised by maximise net biodiversity gain. But in the context of Nottinghamshire, it may just be helpful to be aware that the habitats that can be achieved through the excellent development briefs that we have that are very biodiversity focused through this minerals plan, it's actually likely to be the most significant contributor to achieving both the targets in the 25-year plan and hopefully the new 30% target of any other, not knowing yet what's happening with the environmental land management schemes for agriculture. So I suppose it's just whether it's helpful for you to realise how incredibly important mineral restoration is in this county to achieve the targets for those priority habitats, particularly the ones that cannot be easily restored on arable land on farmland because of the condition of that land with its highly ameliorated, highly fertilised, highly limed soils. And that mineral sites are the most important contributor to some of these very special habitats like heathlands and species-rich grasslands. So we just want to be careful that in rephrasing any wording of this, we don't end up having an unintended consequence of setting a 10% gain in line with the Environment Bill, which in fact will be considerably less than anything we've ever achieved in restoration schemes in Nottinghamshire to date, nor I think would be consistent with the policy of what the county is trying to do, which is recognising how important biodiversity-led restoration is. That is their intention.
Okay, thank you. And Professor Roy Haynes Young, please.
Thank you, sir. we would also like to emphasise that we fully support biodiversity net gain as being included, but we would like to emphasise that it should be looked at both at the site and the landscape scale. Landscape, of course, is one of these other geographical factors that should be taken into account in assessing any set of proposals. Distribution needs to be looked at in relation to ecological networks and various other corridors important for the ecological functioning of individual sites. So we'd certainly very much support greater emphasis on achieving net biodiversity gain. However, we would add that if the policy is to be effective, it needs to set out what happens if biodiversity gains are not maximised. Is there, for example, a requirement for a minimum threshold in relation to gain? I think Janice Bradley's point about, expecting more than 10% is an illustration of that. So we would expect greater clarity on what effective biodiversity gain means in this particular context. We'd also expect that while biodiversity gain is taken on board, it's balanced against the need to conserve and protect existing resources. In the long term, biodiversity gain is not going to be achieved if you've lost the resources necessary to achieve that gain. And this is particularly important in the context of climate change. So we would like greater clarity on how the balance between restoration and conservation is to be judged. We would also emphasise that if biodiversity gain is to be a key policy driver, then greater attention needs to be put towards aftercare. Is there an appropriate aftercare period, proposals for management, so that biodiversity gain can be achieved and sustained? I mean, we're looking at sustainable development here, and we're keen on biodiversity gains shouldn't be lost as soon as the developer walks away. Not only in the long term should these management plans be clear, also we would argue that where phased restoration is put in place, then there should be clarity on how these targets would be monitored and strategies modified if restoration is not proceeding as expected. So we would like to suggest that as it stands, while biodiversity gain is an important addition to the plan, unless these other elements are included, the plan would be unsound. The other point I think we would like to make is that, particularly in reference to paragraph 3.5, is that it should be specified what sites are being considered, not only SSIs and national nature reserves, but local wildlife sites and local nature reserves as well. We believe these should be included in paragraph 3.5 in order that, as the NPPF suggests, opportunities can be identified for biodiversity restoration and strengthening ecological networks. Unless these local sites are taken into account at an early stage, these opportunities are less likely to be realised. So that's our position. We believe that in relation to SP2, it's currently unsound unless these other clarifying points on biodiversity gain and the balance between restoration and conservation are taken into account. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Miss Osborne-James, please. Would you respond to those points?
Thank you, sir. I think the key thing perhaps to raise in relation to this policy is it is a strategic policy. The policies of the plan need to be read as a whole. We don't think it would be appropriate for that particular policy to try and set targets. I don't see really how that policy could expand in terms of sort of targets that are not yet sort of set in environmental legislation or national policy. Just to pick up the point on aftercare again, the detailed points raised by Mr. Haynes Young, that's covered under Development Management Policy 12. That would set out the arrangements for restoration, aftercare and management schemes. And similarly, looking for detail here in terms of which sites are or aren't covered within the policy. Again, under the development management chapter, there is a policy there that goes into much more detail on the biodiversity and the designations and so on. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. North.
Thank you, sir. I think Miss Osborne-James has covered off the points I was going to make. I mean, but coming back to Miss Bradley's point, you know, you cannot, this sector can't be have separate approaches to every other sector. As Miss Osborne-James says, we have to wait for, you know, we have to wait for the Environment Bill to pass, if it does pass. We can't just make up things on the hoof. And this industry, this sector has a record second to none in the country in terms of providing biodiversity improvements. Miss Bradley mentioned landscape. Well, there's one classic example in Nottinghamshire in itself in terms of landscape biodiversity restoration. That's the Trent Valley with the sites of Beththorpe, etc. And she should, you know, and Nottingham Wildlife Trust are involved in that, so she should well know the record there. Again, coming back to Professor Haynes Young's comments, again, a lot of what he was concerned about is wrapped up in development management. And when planning applications are processed, long-term aftercare is a matter of condition, and if it needs extended aftercare, it can be dealt with under Section 106 agreements, as long as we have Section 106 agreements. So, as I say, those issues are dealt with. So we can't prejudice, we can't discriminate against this sector, and as I say, make up net gain percentages on the hoof.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Ratcliffe, do you wish to make any comments?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Just really to try and reassure Professor Haynes Young that the industry has got about 50 years experience in providing biodiversity outcomes for mineral sites. We put a lot of effort into it. We realise it's very popular. Anything to make us popular has to be encouraged. All the concerns that he mentioned are already well provided for. But there was one concern I had, which we raised in our original representations, and I won't go into it in a great deal of detail, but the push for greater biodiversity in sites has to be balanced against other considerations. It can't just be a complete push for total biodiversity. There's best and most versatile land to consider as well, and the potential policy conflict. If our biodiversity actions are popular, we know through extensive contact with the general public that they don't like to see large-scale landscape change. They prefer to see, if mineral working takes place, land returned in its original state. They really like to see agricultural land, perverse as that may seem to a biologist. But there is also national policy that backs that up to return BMV land to original quality if we can. We do have limits to that. There's not enough fill material generally in the open countryside to do that in every case, but we try and do as much as we can. But it just there was a concern that was raised in our minds that the plan really is not sufficiently clear about the balance to be struck between biodiversity and soils conservation. And we did suggest an amendment to this policy which made that clear. So I'd just like to reiterate that request really. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And Miss Bradley, did you wish to make further comment?
Please, if I could just come back on a couple of those points. I think the first one about best and most fertile land, absolutely, this is a tension that we've all long, recognised and commented on elsewhere and in my earlier submissions on this plan. The point is, there is government policy that talks about restoration of best and most fertile land, but there's also extremely long-standing government policy that pays farmers very large amounts of money to take best and most fertile land out of production to create habitats. That's what the entire countryside stewardship and all the agri-environment schemes aim to do. So we have a differential interpretation of national policy there anyway, or an application of it, I should say. And again, I go back to the point that when mineral sites are restored to high-value biodiversity habitats, which they are, that is an effective use of that land. It doesn't require extra funds from the public purse like stewardship does. And it's not removing land out of agriculture because that land hasn't been used for agriculture for the duration of the working of the scheme. So I think, yes, there are definitely national and local policy conflicts, but I think that's important to recognise. There is at least 7 times as much land in Nottinghamshire, best and most fertile land, that's been taken out of farming by government policy and paid to be put into habitat for stewardship. Than might be lost if these sites were wholly restored back to farmland, which would be catastrophic. So I think that's important. The other point that the gentleman made earlier about the long history of the industry for restoration, absolutely, and I did very carefully caveat my comments that I recognise much good work has been done to date, and that the county's biodiversity-led plan is an excellent way forward. As I say, my concern there, though, is that we don't want to effectively go backwards over what's already been achieved, and there is a risk of doing that by pegging targets to the Environment Bill targets, because they're not designed for this sector, and this is an exceptional sector. And I disagree with the gentleman's case that the mineral sector shouldn't be making great strides in this direction. And having been to several MPA award dinners, where the value of restoration to those local communities and the landscape and to the companies themselves is highly promoted, I would suggest this is something where the sector ought to be happy to continue to lead and to bring as much land forward into biodiversity conservation and to help to meet those national and local targets.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Haynes Young.
Thank you very much for letting me go back. Yes, we've never suggested that the industry is remiss in restoring habitats. In fact, there's very good practice out there. So we're certainly not casting aspersions on the industry. The issue today, however, is we're considering the plan as it exists, not the performance of the industry. And it seems to us we're not making up things on the hoof. So, for example, paragraph 174 of the National Policy Planning Framework says that it should promote conservation, restoration, enhancement of priority habitats, ecological networks, and the protection and recovery of priority species, and identify and pursue opportunities for securing measurable gains in biodiversity. Now, this is not legislation in the pipeline. This is criteria set out in the MPPF. So all we're asking for is that if biodiversity gains are included in the plan, then it should be more than lip service, and it should identify strategically how ecological networks would be strengthened and enhanced by the particular geographical spread of sites as proposed, and that the opportunities for securing measurable gains in biodiversity at landscape scale as well as at site scale should be identified. We have one more point about biodiversity gains, but I think that's the key one we make at this point. So if I could come back in a second.
Okay, would the council like to respond to the point? I think it was part 1 of policy SP2, restoration schemes that seek to maximise biodiversity gains, or should that include the word net biodiversity gains? Would the council like to respond to that?
Sorry, sir. I think if we look at the proposed modification, PM10, We had looked to insert the wording in there about achieving a net gain in biodiversity.
Yes.
To reflect what is in the framework.
Yes,
was there
I see.
another point, sorry, related to that?
Well, if a development results in loss of biodiversity, so say, for example, a locally designated site, presumably, so the policy SP2 is concerned with restoration, isn't it? Rather than so SP2 is looking at restoration schemes rather than the complete development as a whole. Is that right?
Yes, sir. It's a strategic policy looking to make the most of opportunities for biodiversity. It hasn't been written to say that all sites must be restored back to a biodiversity use, but it's recognising, as Mr. Bradley has alluded to, the unique opportunities there to take those opportunities if they're available, and that's not preferring, one use against another, but to make the most of the opportunities when restoring the site back. It doesn't preclude agricultural land use, and I do believe we did make a minor change at the publication stage to reflect the point made by Mr. Radcliffe. The two can coexist.
Yes, but if the development, I just wanted to be clear that if the development itself results in the loss of biodiversity, is the intention of this policy to secure a net gain, taking into account that loss? So is the intention that the final restoration would have more biodiversity than the site at the moment before development takes place?
Sorry, sir, I think I'm struggling with that question. Could you just give us perhaps one moment just to confer on that with my colleague?
Yes, okay. Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, sir. Oh, one moment, sorry. So I just want to call up one of the other policies just to double check the exact wording there. Sorry, sir. I think just to start with, we'd just like to clarify that the policy would also need to be read in combination with policy DM4, which would set out the specific requirements in terms of impacts on biodiversity. In terms of the specific point on net gain, our understanding is that the national policy would be looking for the situation that you'd have to judge the net gain against. If there were a loss as part of the development, that what's being reinstated is offering a gain over and above that.
Yes.
I can't, I don't think the national policy would be trying to have a position that you would be able to work the site, reduce the quality of it, and then claim a gain simply by some improvements.
Yeah.
It would have to be that overall net gain.
Okay, thank you. And how would you actually measure net gain then? It may be an awkward question, but if you're losing an existing site of biodiversity value where you've already got that, it's already established, and if you're sort of putting something back, it takes time to establish, doesn't it? So
I think in that particular instance, we would have to be guided by colleagues, expert advice from Natural England, our own ecologists, to weigh up the merits of what was being proposed, and if there's more substantial guidance that comes out in relation to biodiversity net gain.
Sir, perhaps could I interject at this point?
Yes, okay.
So Nick Crouch, Notts County Council. I'm the council's ecologist. Excuse me. So you may be aware that there is something called a net gain calculator, which DEFRA has produced, a 2.0 version of the calculator. So this is quite a complex spreadsheet-based approach where you basically you plug in the losses that are being caused by the development, and also then the gains that would be delivered through the restoration. And the calculator weighs up those losses and gains and determines whether there would be a net gain delivered at the end. So there is a tool in existence which allows that net gain calculation to be carried out.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and Miss Bradley, do you want to say anything?
I mean, I suppose all I would add to that is that obviously, in general, if there is an area of valuable habitat that would be lost as a result of the scheme, then we would consider that to be a pretty significant failure of policy in the first place, because we shouldn't actually ever have arrived at that point, clearly, because those sorts of impacts should be avoided in the first instance. But as Nick Crouch says, absolutely, there is a calculator that can be used that measures that. It is a tool that's open to quite a lot of interpretation. You can have different considerable interpretation on how the calculator is used and how it is scored at the end, which becomes quite a subject for debate. So it is a useful tool, but it does have its limitations, as I know Nick knows as well, because we've both ferreted our way through some very significant spreadsheets of this net gain calculator. But as I say, one would hope you wouldn't get to a point where you'd lose it anyway, but going forward from any position, even the lowest value habitat present on a site prior to working does have some value, and obviously there should always be gain above that, even if it's a fairly low starting point. There could be significant gain. I come back to the fact that mineral sites are uniquely placed to do this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And Professor Haynes Young, please.
Yes, we're also familiar with the biodiversity calculator and its various problems. In order to help its smooth application, should it be resorted to, we would also suggest the plan should, in requirement, to consider both off and off-site impacts, i.e. the site should be looked at in its ecological context. And we're aware of situations where the off-site impacts are as significant. So I think that should be there somewhere if to be used. Going back to the point you made earlier, sir, this is very much what we were saying about the balance between conservation and restoration. And for the council to say, well, it's all covered in DM4, it may well be in words, but actually the strategic policy should set out the framework within which that balance between conservation and restoration. Unless it is, we end up in the current situation where sites are being proposed that have a highly negative long-term impact on biodiversity. I mean, if these mechanisms are in place in the current plan, how do we end up with sites that have a score of -3 in terms of its long-term ecological impact? Seems to defy logic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more points?
Could the council respond to that, possibly?
Are there any? Yes, could the council please come back on that?
Thank you, sir. I think a lot of the points that are being raised are perhaps now getting confused with some of the sustainability appraisal scoring. I don't see from in a planning way how that could be reflected into the policy. That isn't how the policy is intended to work. I'm not sure really there's much we can add to what's sort of been discussed and has been submitted in a written statement on that point.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Right, any more points on policy SP2? Okay, policy SP3 climate change.
I'll depart for now if that's okay, and I do appreciate you. Obviously, I would normally, under any circumstances, attend a whole hearing. I know it's impolite not to, but you'll appreciate I am working under very difficult circumstances here.
Yes, I appreciate that, and thank you very much for your contributions this afternoon.
Thank you.
Mr. North?
Janice Bradley.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, SP3. It takes Mr. Ratcliffe's earlier point actually about agricultural land, and I note that the council at PM13 are proposing a reworded policy on this. But I did submit at the time, and I still contend that at 2D PM13 we should add in an agricultural land to support food production, because future food production is just as an important issue of climate change as all the other things that have been listed in that policy. And again, it's a general trend that it may not be deliberate, but agricultural restoration seems to be ignored in this plan.
Okay, would the council respond to that, please?
Thank you, sir. Just in terms of the point that agricultural restoration is ignored in the plan, paragraph 3.14 of the plan, I think, specifically refers to possibility of agricultural restoration in relation to the previous policy we were discussing. And that was added in to reflect those concerns that had been raised at previous consultation stage.
Okay. Miss Owen, you wish to make a comment?
Yes, sir. Just looking, I'm on SP3 now. So looking at the amended policy, we've still got in SP3.1 that location is to be an issue which will help with greenhouse gases and climate change. So then that is admirable. However, and also just in support of that, in our submission that I made to the publication version, Appendix 2 of that is an assessment of the ability to reduce greenhouse gases and impact on climate change by the location of mineral in specific areas, in particular in the south of the county. And that has information there in the conclusion about how much carbon could be saved if you were to make sure that the sites are located in the correct place. So that's the policy. However, it impacts on the whole plan, because if and this goes back to the geographical spread of the sites, if the sites aren't spread correctly in the first place, then you're not going to be able to comply with this policy. So it's important that the allocations, we've got permitted reserves, they are where they are. However, there is a method to influence and to improve climate change in a positive way by looking at where the allocations are in relation to the proposed development which will use the aggregates in the county. And that is in my actual statement made to the publication version, and that's at page 20 and 21, where I look at the distribution of proposed development going forward, the allocations, and also the permitted reserves. And the disparity that we have currently got with the Minerals Local Plan as it stands at the moment between the proposed development in the county and the proposed mineral reserves that are going to come forward to meet that requirement. So basically, we've got too much development and too little mineral in the south, and vice versa in the Newark and Mansfield areas. So in that way, I feel that this policy is in conflict with the allocations that have already been proposed in the plan.
Okay, thank you. Would the council please respond to those points?
Thank you, sir. I think we have sort of already responded in terms of the underlying reasons behind the geographical spread and the sort of factors that have to be balanced in there in terms of the amount of mineral available at sites, when they'll come on stream, and so on. I would point out, sir, that I think some of the detailed analysis and evidence that has been put forward as part of this submission is focused on a particular site that was promoted for inclusion in the plan and hasn't been allocated. I'm not sure how valid that is, as it's aimed at justifying the inclusion of a particular site versus the approach of the plan as a whole. Thank you.
Professor Haynes Young.
Just to take that point up, I think this is an illustration of the lack of proper geographical analysis in the first place. It's not to do with a particular site. It's to do with the absence of a proper set of criteria by which you judge particular geographical distributions. So as we said in our opening statements, there are a number of geographical distributions in the south that could be considered. How do you compare them? The plan has no mechanism for doing that, or it's not shared it with us. Our other point is on a specific wording in that policy, and it's really a request for sort of clarification. It's the phrase in, let me just get it up on the screen. It's in part C there. It talks about habitat creation, carbon storage, and flood alleviation. And we're curious about the term alleviation. Of course, we know what flood alleviation is. Is the implication there that flood risk should not be changed, or that there should be some reduction in flood risk? We're particularly interested in this because in some locations, many locations in the Trent Valley, flood risk in the future is increasing. So we would expect that any development and restoration should take that into account and offer not just zero impact on flood risk, but actually some net gain for the community in terms of reducing flood risk. Thank you.
Thank you. And Miss Owen.
Yes, so just to come back on the point that the council were making about what I was saying was in relation to a specific site. It wasn't actually, because if you look at my evidence, pages 20 to 21, no site is mentioned. It looks at the geographical distribution between the north of the county, the Newark area, and the south of the county.
Okay, thank you. And Miss Osborne-James. Would you like to respond to the points that have been made?
Yes, sir. Perhaps if we can just go back slightly, could I just ask for clarification from Mr. Haynes Young about the wording of the policy that he mentioned the word alleviate in there, and I'm struggling to follow the point that he was making. If you could just reiterate that, please. Oh, it's at the end.
Okay, perhaps I'm being naive here, but I would interpret the word alleviate to mean that it would reduce the risk of flooding. So if one's looking at particular proposals, one would expect a net reduction in flood risk as a result of the restoration scheme, or that there's should be some other measures in place. So the corollary of that really is, well, how much alleviation do you expect? I mean, you're expecting biodiversity gain, okay? Are you expecting simply a development to be neutral in relation to flood risk, or are you actually expecting some net gain for the community in terms of reduced flood risk?
Thank you. Yes, as with the biodiversity net gain, yeah, the intention would be there that there would be some improvement to the existing flood situation. This reflects guidance and policy at the national level. Again, I think in terms of strategic policy, it's difficult to suggest a way of putting in a target or quantification in the way that you're asking. You're looking for a very scientific answer to what is a broad strategic policy, a direction of travel that we believe reflects national policy and guidance on this. At a detailed level, when sites were being considered, we take into account information in strategic flood risk assessment, advice from Environment Agency, the local flood authority, and those sorts of bodies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Professor Roy Haynes Young, do you want to respond?
No, just to respond to that, I mean, I think we're looking at a framework for evidence-based planning. Simply that, really.
Okay, thank you. Any more comments from anyone about Policy SP3 climate change? Okay, Policy SP4 sustainable transport. I would just like to, I've just got one question. Yes, sorry, paragraph 2 of policy SP4 states it refers to all new mineral working and mineral related development. And presumably, does this refer to extensions to existing quarries as well as new quarries?
Yes, the policy would be intended to capture any new development.
Okay.
Obviously, it can't apply retrospectively to an existing site.
No, okay.
Would it be helpful to suggest a wording change there in that case?
Possibly, yes, just to make it clear whether it's in the policy or in the supporting text.
Thank you, sir.
Miss Owen.
Yes, it's really in relation to barge transport, and you did ask the question about whether commercial viability, and the council have answered that by giving you some examples. But again, I come to the point, and here I'm afraid I might be site specific, come to the point about how has the plan as a whole dealt with this? Because it seems to me that alternative transport methods have been put to the fore in the plan, and we've been talking about that with regard to the overview. But actually, when it comes down to the detail of how the plan will be delivered in terms of actual mineral coming out of sites and being distributed, the plan hasn't tackled this at all. And in particular, with regard to the barge transport, opportunities to allocate sites where this could have been genuinely brought forward have not been taken by the council. And I think that's rather disturbing in terms of the overarching proposals for low carbon economy, for climate change, and for keeping HGVs off the roads.
Okay, Miss Osborne-James.
Thank you, sir. Just to sort of clarify, the policy SP4 would be applied to any applications coming forward during the life of the plan and promotes opportunities where practical for alternatives to road transport. However, the potential for barge transport isn't the only factor to be considered in site selection. This also needs to take account of other physical and environmental factors, as well as the available tonnage and proximity to market. In preparing the plan as set out in our site selection methodology and within the sustainability appraisal documents, the council's taken account of the potential for sites to transport material by barge. None of the existing sites where extensions were proposed have the potential for barge transport, and only one of the new sites that was put forward had this potential. This could have taken, I believe, approximately a quarter of the material produced a relatively short distance by barge to Colwick Wharf, where it would have been transferred back onto road. Overall, this would still have resulted in a higher level of HGV movements than those that are proposed with the Mill Hill allocation. Clearly, we are seeking to promote opportunities for non-road transport where this is possible, but obviously we have to take account of where it's feasible and economic as well, and weigh in those other factors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Miss Owen, please.
Yes, sir. Just to take up that point about barging the material into Colwick Wharf. First of all, Colwick Wharf is actually protected in the local plan, so one would have assumed that the council were envisaging that it would be used for bringing mineral along the river, and we already have an amendment which demonstrates that the material from Newark cannot be brought up to the sites where it's needed in Nottingham by the river. And this council themselves, where they've actually given you some examples of where barges are used, you'll see that some of them transfer the material a very short distance. And yet this is considered to be acceptable and in terms of economically viable. Also, just to be clear about what was proposed for, and I'll mention it, the Shelford site, that taking the material down to Colwick Wharf, where it would have been used in concrete batching, and from there taken onto sites in Nottingham. So there would have been a net reduction in carbon and other greenhouse gases, because we would have cut the journey time when the material has to be in a lorry by a significant amount.
Thank you. Right. Mr. North, please.
Thank you, sir. I note on the proposed amendments that the county have put forward that they intend taking paragraph 3 of that policy out, which I agree with and had suggested. It's unfortunate they haven't provided proposed rewording of paragraph 1, because I do have concerns about this, the statement of maximise the use of sustainable forms of transport, because that cannot be at no limit. And I did suggest some additional wording on the end of that should be where practical and economic, because you can't ignore, firstly, the availability of so-called sustainable transport, and secondly, its economic viability.
Okay, Miss Osborne-James, would you come back on that, please?
Thank you, sir. I believe those points are made within the supporting text. And the policy does allow for where it's demonstrated that those forms of transport are not necessarily viable. It does allow for road transport in those circumstances. It isn't precluding road transport in that sense. So I was just looking for the specific reference in the supporting text. I think it's paragraph 3.43 within the supporting text addresses that point, sir.
Okay, Mr. North.
I'll just argue, sir, that issue needs to be in the policy itself, not supporting text. And you know, we talked about agricultural land earlier. Again, that's been relegated to supporting text, and it elevates all the other issues that are stated in policy above those issues. It would be my argument. If it's important, which I think it is, it should be in the policy.
Okay, does the council wish to respond to that, or is that?
Yes, sir, thank you. I think in listening to the debate, in terms of responses made earlier, we had felt that it was sufficient to make that recognition within the supporting text. But if it would offer reassurance and for clarity, we can look at whether or not some wording along the lines of where practical could be added to the end of part 1 of the policy, if that meets concerns.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I mean, I'm grateful for that concession by the County Council at Mr. North's suggestion, because that would go a long way to meeting the concerns that we had about perhaps what was and still is an oversimplistic approach to alternative means of transport. I mean, in general, companies will usually go for the most economic solution to problems, and one would expect them to. There are a number of things considerations which are very specific in terms of both rail and water transport, which mean that they can't economically or viably be used. And it's only when those specific conditions are satisfied that it becomes a real possibility. And it would have improved the plan. I know we're not here to talk about improvements, but it nevertheless would have improved the reading of the plan and guidance to plan users had those specific requirements been spelt out in some detail, as we suggested. There is one other suggestion, sir, that I made in our representations originally, and that is over the policy's intention to have sites well located to their markets, in close proximity to proposed markets. It appears to us, sir, that if the intention is to minimise mineral miles and reduce the need to travel, as national policy requires us to do, then not only is that a locational consideration for sites within the county in terms of their markets, but we raise the issue, it surely also must include an intention to reduce the numbers of unnecessary imports. In other words, the county should not be in a position where it is importing material that could be supplied locally. And that would result in a very significant sustainability gain if it did that. In other words, if it sought to supply as much of its own needs as possible. Now, I recognise that the county is already a net exporter, and no doubt they would appeal to that, saying why they don't need to change anything. But I think it's an important consideration. So for every county to seek to reduce the amount of material which is imported, which could be produced locally. Now, obviously, in terms of certain things like crushed rock for roadstone, that's not possible because there is no resource in the county for that, and we understand that consideration wouldn't apply. But in terms of the abundance of sand and gravel resource in the county, there really is no excuse to say import large quantities of material from nearby counties. The receiving counties for the exports for Nottinghamshire material may have an excuse in the sense that they may be resource deficient, therefore require imports of material from Nottinghamshire. But we consider that the policy should be changed to reflect that sustainability aspiration, and that would accord with both the vision and the objectives of the plan, and also be in line with national policy.
Is that I mean, that's a point that you're making in relation to sustainable transport, but there seems to be a wider point, really. Does it relate to?
Well, it does relate to the matters we'll be discussing tomorrow morning, sir. Yes, it does, but it surely at the back of that is a transport issue, essentially. Yeah. This is the reason why you would do it. This is why you would seek to plan for supplies indigenously, as MPPF puts it.
Okay. Could the council respond to that latter point, please? The point about reducing the amount of imported material.
Sir, thank you. I don't think we would dispute the sustainability argue being made there. The plan obviously seeks to make provision to meet its own needs and the assessed needs in other areas where they are deficient. We've undertaken to continue to supply areas who are reliant on us. I will raise the point about the county exporting 60% of its sand and gravel, for example. We are reliant on other areas for crushed rock, as has been mentioned earlier. I think there is a difficulty here, and I don't know how far the policy could go to address that, in that to a certain extent imports and exports will be a market commercial decision between operators. It depends who wins a contract for a particular construction project, and we as the Minerals Planning Authority don't necessarily have control over that. We couldn't really, in that sense, word a policy that tried to sort of prevent imports or exports per se. Don't think there's much more I can add to that, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Miss Owen, you've had your hand up for quite a while, I think.
Yes, so it's just really a point of clarification in connection with the amount of material it was proposed that could be put on to the river and taken by barge to Colwick Wharf. And in fact, actually, it was 180,000 tonnes per annum. And I don't think that's an insignificant amount. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Haynes Young.
Yes, we'd also suggest that the text needs to be clarified, just to emphasise that a sustainable geographical distribution is not one which is simply determined by the proximity of market to market and transport costs. In an earlier presentation, Miss Osborne James said that, in a particular instance, that would be balanced against other factors, but it's not clear here how those things are actually balanced. We can see that, transport costs would be reduced for a developer, but it could be that selecting a site that's unsustainable environmentally, for example, simply shifts the costs to society. So we would seek in this policy to have some qualification about the way in which proximity to market and transport costs are balanced against these other sustainability criteria. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Osborne-James, would you come back on that, please? It's been covered to some extent previously, but could you respond to that particular point, please?
I think I would have to reiterate earlier comments, sir, that this is a strategic policy, and that those kinds of quantifications are probably not really appropriate to that type of policy. In terms of the points being raised by Mr. Haynes Young as to how judgments have been made, this is set out in the site's selection methodology. I don't think it's a matter for the sustainable transport policy to be justifying the site selection process. I'm a little uncertain as to where the line of questioning is going. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, okay, yes.
We agree it's a strategic, we're looking at the strategy, okay, and we understand a strategy to mean the criteria by which you would make decisions. Otherwise, it's not a strategy. And we're simply asking here for what is the kind of strategic thinking that balances proximity to market and transport costs against the other policy areas that determine sustainability. We're not asking about particular sites. We're simply saying, why does proximity to market and transport costs seem to trump these other sustainability criteria?
So this policy is about transport. It is specifically around what the plan can do and reasonably influence in terms of transporting minerals by whatever means. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay, I have no further questions on SP4. Does anyone else have anything they wish to add? No. Okay. SP5 is the built, historic and natural environment. I think the council, I have a note that the council agreed, I think in your statements, in one of your hearing statements, you agreed a modification to paragraph 3.54. But that doesn't appear in the schedule of the modifications. If the council could just make a note of that, please.
Sorry, sir. Yes, that is an omission. We do intend to make that change as indicated in our written statement. We do have a note of that. Thank you.
And Mr. North, do you wish to comment on SP5?
Yes, please, sir. I've got a couple of points on the policy itself and a further 2 points on some of the supporting text. The first bullet point of the policy, and if you like, the first supporting paragraph of that policy, isn't in accordance with MPPF paragraph 171 in terms of in that it should distinguish between the hierarchy of international, national and locally designated sites. The policy as drafted doesn't do that. Moving on to policy bullet point 3, it's a similar point. Paragraph 189 of MPPF shows there has to be a distinction made between different qualities of heritage assets. Again, I don't believe that's done in the policy. Moving on to supporting text, paragraph 3.63. And again, in my statement, I suggested some deletions in this. I have concerns about the reference to or planned future infrastructure. And the reason I have concerns of that is that having that phrase in that supporting text is likely to sterilise mineral that could otherwise be worked on the hope that some planned infrastructure may come along, which we often know can take 20 years to be in the pipeline and could still never happen. And that goes to the point of sustainability as well, so I think. And finally, the last sentence of that paragraph 363 should again be deleted in my view, in that it goes beyond the planning regime. That such issues as described in that sentence are dealt with under the mining code. And having that sentence in the plan could well prejudice a developer's rightful claims for sterilisation of workable reserves due to the presence of infrastructure. That's all, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think this is a strategic policy, and I think there's another DM policy relating to heritage assets.
Yes, so there are policies relating to both heritage and the biodiversity assets. It DM6 and DM4. Sorry.
Okay, so would the council would you wish to respond to the points made by Mr. North there, please?
I think the response would simply be, sir, that we view the policy as a strategic policy, and the specific points raised about the hierarchy and importance of certain designations is drawn out more under those development management policies. So we're prepared to talk a little bit more about that under that session if you're happy with that approach.
Yes.
Thank you.
And the point under Mr. North made a couple of points under infrastructure. There's a paragraph 3.63. And the first point was the second sentence refers to planned future infrastructure.
Yes, sir.
Is that sort of overly restrictive?
We didn't believe it was, sir, and in making our response at the previous consultation stages, we didn't feel this was fettering the industry in any way. It simply reflects the sort of the approach that we see taken through planning applications. Utility providers and so on often ask for certain safeguards to be added as caveats to planning conditions, or they're put on there as an informative. We thought the text in this paragraph was helpful to draw attention to that, to highlight that there needs to be a balance and a recognition of those factors. We didn't consider that wording to be overly onerous.
And the last sentence refers to the need for appropriate standoffs from cables, pipelines, etc. And that's covered, as Mr. North says, that's covered under the mining code, I believe it is. Would you like to comment on that?
It's possibly a point I'd like to take back to my development management colleagues, but the purpose of that text was really to alert developers and applicants to those possible requirements, depending on the nature of the development.
Okay, thank you. And now, is it Mr. Keane would like to speak on that? Is that right?
So thank you. I just wanted to take 2 points, please. One, responding to Mr. North's point about SP5 and hierarchies, for example, in relation to heritage assets, he drew attention to. As Mrs. Osborne James has already pointed out, the approach to the assessment of heritage assets, designated or otherwise, is detailed, or is provided in more detail in the relevant development management policy. So this isn't a policy that ignores the fact that heritage assets, or indeed particular conservation issues or landscape issues have a hierarchy that needs to be applied. It's simply looking at them in this strategic sense, and the development management policies follow. And the second point, so while I'm on, it's not on the same point, but you mentioned the council has already accepted that paragraph 3.54 of the supporting text needs some amendment, but that the wording hasn't yet made its way through in the proposed mods. That's right, so it does, because in essence, if it's it may assist a little bit, because I know others have made representations on this, including some concerns raised by the parish council, that effectively what 354 is doing at the moment is attempting a brave summary of a couple of the paragraphs in the framework. I think 183 and 184 and 193, and in the process has sort of merged them a bit quickly, if I can put it that way. So there just needs to be a little bit more detail put back into the text to reflect things in the way that the framework says them. Otherwise it gets, because heritage issues are complicated enough without injecting a new level of wording into the exercise. So that's the purpose behind the amendment that's suggested, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Thank you again, sir. Just to reiterate something that the County Council said in response to Mr. North about the mining code, that the problem is that the County Council will not be aware, when there's a consultation response received, what the commercial arrangements between the infrastructure undertaker and the landowner is. And although it shouldn't happen, I can assure you that it's quite common, or more common than it ought to be, that infrastructure operators will try and get a standoff included in a planning permission when there are already compensation arrangements to the landowner should the mineral be required. So it's, you know, if the County Council is going to go down this route, then what they will have to do is ask the consultees for proof that there are no compensation arrangements already in place and the mining code doesn't apply. Because if they don't do that, then a number of things could pass through the system to the disadvantage of both mineral owners and mineral operators. And it really is frustrating what has been provided for in law for well over a century and a half.
Okay, thank you. And Professor Haynes Young, please.
Yes, it's just really a matter of clarification. We were surprised that the list of infrastructure there didn't include flood banks, flood protection. We're not familiar with the mining code. Is that an omission, or was it covered somewhere else?
What do you think the reference to the mining code should be included in this?
No, we are unfamiliar with the mining code, and we were wondering why there was no reference to flood banks in that particular list of infrastructure, which seemed to be particularly relevant in the kinds of location where these sites are proposed.
So, as I recall, the text wasn't intended to be exhaustive. It was pointing to the, some of the common utilities and services where this gets raised. If it would be helpful to add something in there about flood banks, we can certainly look at that.
Okay. Okay, and Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Yes. So if I might be able to clear that up. The mining code really refers back to a number of. You don't need to know the details. Railways and other facilities supports acts throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century, and it really is a compensation arrangements for when mineral working, and obviously prior to any planning system approaching something like a railway or a canal. River levies, as they would fall under the responsibility of the Environment Agency. and you can be well assured that they will seek to protect them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any more comments on SP5? No. SP6 deals with the Nottinghamshire Green Belt. Does anyone have any specific comments on that policy? No. And SP7 deals with minerals safeguarding, consultation areas and associated minerals infrastructure. Now, earlier on in this session, I think we covered Mr. North's point about the inclusion of the wording economically important. I think that was in relation to strategic objective, wasn't it? But those words appear in this policy as well. But I think we've already discussed that point. I mean, do you want to add anything, Mr. North?
Yes, please, sir. I don't want to prolong the discussion, but I would point you to PPG, paragraph 27, first bullet point, which states, and this is in relation to mineral planning authorities safeguarding mineral resources, uses the best available information on the location of all, my emphasis, all mineral resources in the authority area. There's no qualification, it's all. And coming back to the point Mrs. Conway made on the issue, I did put forward suggested wording for a policy, safeguarding policy, but it is common in such policies to have a long list of safeguarding exemption criteria that a mineral planning authority can apply that will prevent small-scale planning issues falling foul of any safeguarding policy. So I say I don't want to over-egg the pudding, but I am very clear in my own mind that MPPF is very clear that all mineral resources, all known mineral resources, should be safeguarded.
Okay, thank you. And Mrs. Conway?
Thank you. I'm not talking about resources, I'm talking about the associated infrastructure and the requirements of paragraph 204E. I've looked at the comments that the council have made about it not being their responsibility to safeguard strategic or non-strategic facilities, and I don't read or don't interpret paragraph 204E of the MPPF the same way. I think it's very clear that planning policies should include safeguarding of existing and planned infrastructure or associated facilities. And I would suggest that the Mineral Planning Authority are the most appropriate place to include policies for safeguarding those. It's not really the role of the local authority to take that on board.
Well, that was a question that I had written down actually. Are there any? I mean, the paragraph 204E refers to specific types of associated infrastructure, such as bulk transport, for example. I mean, are there? I mean, how many of these facilities are there in the county, and where are they? I mean, I just remain a bit concerned, really, that there's no provision in the plan for safeguarding as required by paragraph 204E. Could the council clarify exactly, what of these facilities are there, and where are they, and how are they safeguarded?
So my understanding is the wharves are actually, in terms of bulk transport, the wharves for transfer of aggregate are safeguarded under the policy. Unfortunately, they aren't well annotated on the map. They are on there, but because of the volume of information that has been overlaid, and we have undertaken, I think, as one of the proposed modifications to try and improve the mapping and make that much clearer. In terms of the wider point you raise, we have looked at this a number of times in relation to the questions you've posed, and it does cause us an element of sort of difficulty, really, in the sense that yes, there is a requirement on the Minerals Planning Authority to safeguard facilities, and they are set out in paragraph 204E of the framework. However, within the guidance, at paragraph 6 of the planning practice guidance, it does recognise that there can be areas, particularly in areas where there are county and district authorities, responsibility for safeguarding facilities and sites for the storage, handling and transport of minerals in local plans will largely rest with the district planning authority. We are in the position that we do have facilities on our mineral sites, which we've granted permission for and are aware of and control through that regime. But there will be a number of sites on industrial estates in employment areas, such as standalone concrete batching plants, that will have been permitted by the district council in those cases.
Okay, thank you. It would be helpful to me if council could provide me with some further information, as to these facilities, and exactly just some further information so that I can. So we
have, I believe, a colleague of mine has put together a map of those facilities in terms of the aggregates batching plants, and we can provide you with the improved map showing the location of those two wharves.
Okay. And what about all the other facilities like the concrete batching?
My colleague has prepared a map of those that are the district permissions. We've contacted each of the districts to try and find the information on all of those. We obviously hold the records for those sites that are within or adjacent to existing mineral workings, if they're linked to that site. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, really, information about facilities that are linked to existing mineral sites and facilities that would normally be county matter applications.
Yes, so we can provide you with details of those.
I mean, a picture of those so that I can appreciate where they are and how they would be safeguarded, and also do all of the district councils have safeguarding policies in their plans?
As far as I'm aware, they won't have a specific mineral safeguarding policy. They will have employment policies protecting their employment areas, and this would then bring in the agent of change principle through the MPPF if those sites were to be if proposals such as housing or a sensitive use was proposed next to them.
Right, okay. Mrs. Conway, do you want to comment on that? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I don't think they all necessarily need marking on a plan to show their exact location, but I think in Nottinghamshire, where there's two-tier authorities, I think the responsibility for safeguarding minerals infrastructure, it's quite clear everything that is covered in paragraph 204E should be identified within the minerals plan, so it's caught somewhere. I've not come across a district, oh actually no, tell a lie, I think the city have got a policy in there about mineral safeguarding infrastructure safeguarding in there now, but they're few and far between.
Mr. North.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, well, I thought what Mrs. Conway's just said, and I note under modification PM21, the council intend to reference the agent of change principle in a rewording of part of the policy. So again, it would have been helpful if we'd have the wording. But with appropriate wording, I would suggest that, and the application of agents of change, the council could, through this policy, make it clear that standalone operations on an industrial site, for example, a concrete plant, have to be covered by the agent of change. And again, I support Mrs. Conway's interpretation of 204E in the MPPF.
Okay, Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Yes, I mean, both Mr. North and I have extensive experience of making representations about safeguarding policies in local plans. My experience, and I offer this just for the assistance of the inquiry, is that even unitary authorities don't like to identify where their concrete plants are. Mr. North and I had that discussion, I think, in the East Riding not too long ago. But I think Ms. Conway is wrong. You must, in accordance, I think, with the Planning Acts, if you have a policy, it must be able to be mapped. So on the proposals map, the proposals and policies map, you should identify where all these are. Now, these days with GIS, we should be able to find a way to do it, but sadly, it's the case that a lot of district councils don't really know that they are required to implement safeguarding, mineral safeguarding issues in their local plans. It was always the intention of CLG's guidance, last issued in 2011, to for the whole system to be as one. And this level at the county level was the first stage of that. And once that is passed, the idea was that, and I think still is, that that the district councils will there next give implementation to those policies in their own local plans and echo mineral safeguarding concerns in their own policies. It could be left to the next stage if you so decide, sir, but I would expect the Mineral Planning Authority to put in a great deal of effort and be very diligent in reminding their district colleagues of the necessity to safeguard these sorts of infrastructure sites, because unless they do so, it's very unlikely that they will ever be protected.
If wording was added into policy SP7 to include the agent of change principle requirement, would that be sufficient to safeguard?
It would help, but unless there is a safeguarding intention, one can imagine that once a district council gets a planning application alongside a concrete plant for a sensitive land use, say a block of flats or some such, they won't be aware that that mineral interest needs to be safeguarded unless there's something in their local plan or something in the minerals local plan that tells them it should be. So just having an agent of change statement in the policy, whilst it is very welcome, in my view, it won't be sufficient.
Okay, Mr. North, please.
Just on that point, sir, I think, as I said, the agent of change principle is a welcome addition to the policy, but it would have to be hand in hand with further appropriate wording or cross-referencing to all the sites concerned, which I think has been hinted at already. So it has to be cross-referenced to all mineral infrastructure sites, including standalone concrete plants, etc.
So it would have to be cross-referenced to a policies map showing them.
Well, I would have said so, yes, sir, and I see no good reason why it shouldn't be the case. The policy plan has to, in my understanding, show those sort of developments.
I mean, if district councils often grant planning permissions for these facilities and they're forever changing, it would just be a snapshot in time, wouldn't it? If you manage to map all of the facilities that exist at the moment, well, it would soon become out of date.
Well, potentially, yes, sir. But again, as I say, with appropriate wording, reference could be made to, future development, future mineral infrastructure sites, concrete plants, asphalt plants, etc., etc. And another thing we shouldn't forget is mineral recycling sites here as well. Aggregate recycling.
Okay. Mrs. Osborne James, would you like to comment, please?
Yes, thank you. I think it might be helpful if I draw a little parallel with our waste plan. We have similar safeguarding requirements within the waste local plan. And through our annual monitoring report, we list facilities, all of the waste facilities that the county Waste Planning Authority is given planning permission for. That's available to the districts, and we provide them a mapping layer with that's updated to make them aware. And we respond to our comments on major planning applications. We've looked at whether we could do something similar to reflect the spirit of what is in the MPPF. However, we do have the problem that I think you've just alluded to again yourself, that we have been and done the exercise of mapping those sites as they stand now, but they are district permissions. We wouldn't necessarily be updated each time the district permitted a new site. So we're more than happy to take this away and try and have a look at if there is something more we can offer. But I would have to reiterate that point in terms of those sites that we are responsible for granting planning permission for, and the district's own responsibilities. I mean, we have, on the waste side, we have worked closely with the districts to make them aware of the safeguarding requirements. We work with the districts in terms of our own existing safeguarding on the minerals. We can certainly try and improve their knowledge in terms of the concrete batching plants for which they're responsible.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Ratcliffe.
Yes, thank you, sir. Yeah, well, just to echo really what Mrs. Osborne James just said, that the paragraph in PBG that she referred to, which is 27.6, does say in its last sentence, this will require close cooperation between planning authorities, and I'm glad that there is such cooperation within Nottinghamshire between the different tiers. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to accomplish. There are clearly challenges to do it, but it shouldn't be shirked just because it's difficult. It should be tackled, wholeheartedly to try and solve the issue. And it's not without the wit of local planning authorities to share updated schedules of various types of infrastructure, so that they can keep their plan policies up to date. I mean, it may well be that if there is, in due course, in a revised district local plan, a policy which generally protects, safeguards these sites, and which would have to include a buffer as well. It's not just protecting the site itself, but also from proximal sterilisation. Then that policy could refer to an updated policies and proposals map. And I think, bearing in mind the planning white paper, this sort of arrangement is presumably in the government's mind already for the future revision of the whole system.
Okay, Mr. North.
Yes, I mean, just as an example, I know mineral planning authorities who will inspect as a regular, the weekly lists of their district councils in terms of planning applications. So they are monitoring and would pick up, for example, a new concrete plant or asphalt plant that's being applied for. So, as Mr. Ratcliffe said, it's not beyond the wit of intelligent people to sort that one out.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further comments on the strategic policies? I'll just, I've made a note of all of the comments made in relation to policy SP7 there. If I can leave that with the council just to think about, I think we can return to it in the review session, I think. as to how best to deal with that. Mr. Keane.
So yes, and I mean, I think certainly as Mrs. Osborne James has indicated, we can provide further information along the lines that you sought, and think about mapping, etc. But and looking at the wording of the policy. But we are perfectly happy to take those things away and to have a think about how we can narrow issues perhaps on that. So.
Okay, thanks. Mr. North, do you have a further comment? Oh, okay. And Professor Haynes Young.
Thank you. So it was really just some clarification on your question 22. I'm afraid the sort of discussion rolled over it. You asked, is it appropriate to ask a question about that? Because you said, should the supporting text include reference to air quality, including its potential effect on biodiversity?
Yes, I remember the question. Question 22. Yes. Yes, and the council has responded to say that a new paragraph will be added to the text.
Okay. I must have an old text because it says no comment on mine. Thank you. And we argued it should, along with air quality, include reference to noise, dust, light, and modification to flood regimes. I've not seen the new text, so I look forward to that.
Sir, I've just been quickly looking through the proposed modifications, and you are quite right. In the written statement, we did provide a form of wording there that would insert a new paragraph to the text following XP5.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's fortunately because it's not got a reference to SP5 on it, but it's paragraph 3.57. PM19
yes, yeah.
to add a new subheading and paragraph on air quality below the existing paragraph 357 to address that concern, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much. And are there any questions before we finish for the day? We've made good time there, finishing just before 5 o'clock. So if we could adjourn then, please. And the next session is tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and that is Minerals Provision Policies MP1 and MP2, with the exception of MP2P, which will be in a subsequent session. Are any other points before we finish for the day? Okay, well, thank you all very much, and good evening, and see you tomorrow. Thank you.
you.